So, hey everybody, welcome to chapter 22 on the Renaissance and Mannerism in Cinquecento, Italy. And that is how it's pronounced. It really sounds like you're speaking Italian when you say it. And it actually means 500. So the longer Italian word would have been 1,500. But when you're talking about this time period, we just refer to it as the 500. And we know we're talking about the 1500s in Italy. Sort of like the Quattrocento really meant the 1400s. So the Cinquecento, a really interesting time in world history when we look right at 1500, 1490s, and then into 1500. Again, just a reminder, we're talking about Italy, but we're really talking about the Florence, we're talking about the Republic of Venice, we're talking about the Papal States, where the Pope is in the Papal States, plus some other places. We'll be talking about Milan a little bit in here as well. So I'll keep saying Italian art, but I'm really talking about art from all these different smaller republics and smaller countries that made up Florence. So here's how the world is changing. When Leonardo da Vinci, okay, famous artist, Michelangelo, who we'll be talking about, Raphael, another artist that we'll see. When these artists were born, and that's one of the reasons we ended up calling it the High Renaissance. It's when they were working artists. But when they were born, nobody in Europe, nobody in Africa, or nobody in Asia had ever seen these things. Okay, so on the screen right now is a photograph of a man who's in Peru, South America, and he's a potato farmer. There's over 4,000 different kinds of potatoes that come from just around Peru. So nobody in Europe, Africa, or Asia before Christopher Columbus, before the Europeans reached the New World, nobody in those old world countries, Europe, Africa, Asia, had ever seen potatoes, tomatoes. And you can read the rest of the screen there. Avocados, corn, sweet potatoes, cassava, chocolate, pumpkins, chili peppers, peanuts, pineapples, turkeys, tequila, tobacco. They'd never, of course, never seen tobacco. And of course, they'd never seen the Native Americans, and they'd never seen North and South America. So that's an enormous change for these Europeans, okay, for these Europeans during the Cinquecento, that we go from just knowing about Europe, Asia, Africa, to all of a sudden learning about an entirely new part of the globe. So the High Renaissance, again, major change in the late 1400s, early 1500s, not just for art, but for the world altogether. So that's a good extra credit. The reason that's up there also, it's not in your textbook, that's a good extra credit. So if you remember that when Michelangelo was born, when Leonardo was born, when Raphael was born, nobody had ever seen chili peppers unless they were in the Americas, or chocolate. Imagine it. No corn, no avocados, tough. Okay, so here's why we call the High Renaissance, because of these three artists in particular. So we said the Italians are using this term, the idea of Renaissance, the idea of it being rebirth. They were sort of branding it themselves. And then when people in the mid 1500s look back and they say, oh, when was the high point? When do we think the greatest artists from our Renaissance time period were working? They looked at these three artists. Okay, These are not the only artists, and we'll see other ones as well. And they said, we're going to say that was the high point. Now, that's an opinion. That's not a matter of fact. Art changes all the time, but that's where we get the name High Renaissance from. Something that is important to know, so once you know High Renaissance, something else that's important to know, and we'll talk about this later on, is the whole idea of an artist as a genius. Today, if you see Christopher Nolan, a filmmaker, different art forms, Taylor Swift, I was just watching a football game, Taylor Swift, we'll talk about an artist, a prominent artist, particularly one who seems extra creative. And we don't necessarily use the term genius, but we'll talk about the idea that they do their own thing. They sort of create the world they want to create, and they create the kind of art, music, movies, etc. It wasn't always that way. For most history, most artists that we know about were basically given a job and told by the folks who are giving them a commission, who are ordering the work. We're told, here's exactly what we want you to do. And, I've mentioned that previously, but I want to stress that again. So the way we think about artists today as creative individuals who create things, and the rest of us sort of respond to it, okay? Rather than somebody who's told, oh, you're going to paint this kind of painting. It comes about during the High Renaissance, this idea that the artist is genius. The artist is their sort of self-expressive individual, and the rest of us are kind of watching what they're doing. So you want to know that the idea of the High Renaissance is the idea of an artist is this creative genius, is this idea that really comes out of this high Renaissance time period. But my other note up there says they still work for the church and others. So even though these artists were seen in a different way, and we'll talk about that more, they still had people who employed them. They still had to work for other people, and they were still being told things, even though the model, the notion of what an artist was changing. So you don't need to memorize the dates of these artists, but I put them up so we can be really clear why around 1500 is such a big deal. Because you've heard of Leonardo da Vinci, you've heard of the Mona Lisa. You know, you maybe have heard of Michelangelo. I mentioned before, if you look at the Mutant Ninja Teenage Turtles, 3 of them are the artists that we're seeing right here on the screen: Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So the real people, though, and we're actually going to be learning about them in real life, not just because they were in the cartoons. So we're going to start with Leonardo. Following your textbook, start with Leonardo. This artwork is not in your one of the ones that's on your art checklist, but you may have seen it. It's called the Vitruvian Man. And I have it up on the screen right now just to tell you a little about Leonardo. So he's an incredibly talented guy. He's left-handed, which is kind of cool because I'm left-handed, but he's a military engineer. He plans for defenses for cities. He's an inventor. He came up with things like the helicopter, ideas of the helicopter, hundreds of years before they existed. If you've ever heard of hang gliding, he came up with a hang glider. Okay. He was a painter, which of course, why we're studying him. He was interested as a scientist in anatomy. We'll see an anatomical drawing that he did, optics, the study of how the eye works, etc. So he's from Florence. So those are our 3 big cities where most of these artists tend to come from. But he's got a really famous painting from Milan called The Last Supper that you've also probably heard of. And then you really want to know this. The King of France sort of adopts Leonardo late in Leonardo's life. He sort of takes care of him in his latter days. And that's going to be a big deal for the art world. So you want to know that Leonardo ends up in France. So when you go see some famous paintings by Leonardo, they're in France because that's where they went at the end of his life. So that's Leonardo the person. Okay. Here's his first artwork. And this one is in France. Like I said, it's in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Several terms that I'm going to introduce, and then you'll see them pop up over and over again in the artwork. So you'll see them repeating there. So one of the things that the Renaissance artists do, particularly in the high Renaissance, is they really like pyramidal compositions to create things in the shape of a pyramid or a triangle. Of course, it's a painting. It's on a flat surface. A pyramid would be 3-dimensional, but we're talking about that pyramidal shape. So you see the angel on the right with that really funky red outfit on, and it's leaning forward. He or she's leaning forward. Then Mary is at the top there, and then the baby Jesus, the baby on the left-hand side, that's baby John. He's leaning forward also. And see how it makes a pyramid there? Makes that kind of pyramidal shape. So it's not always going to be exact. We're not saying it's exact, but you want to know about this idea. We call it the Renaissance pyramid. It gets used a lot. And if you get to go to Museum of Fine Arts Houston, you'll see some other Renaissance paintings, and you'll see that same pyramid in the paintings that you can see in real life. So you can call it a pyramid, you can call it a triangle. We're talking about the same thing. Second thing I want you to know about this painting here is called Madonna of the Rocks, is the hand gestures. Really famous, really important in Leonardo's artwork, how he shows the hands, and they sort of take us through the painting. So Mary, for example, is holding her left hand up. Baby Jesus is underneath her. So baby Jesus doesn't have a halo anymore, but her hand functions as a symbol of that. And then see her other right hand, see Mary's right hand goes way around that baby's back on the left-hand side. And it's this beautiful kind of graceful gesture on the baby, on the baby's back there, her right hand on the left side of the screen there. So the hand gestures, then the angel is pointing baby Jesus, that's the blessing gesture. He's the one seated on the ground, and the other baby, that's John the Baptist, is kneeling and pointing him. So these hand gestures, that's what I mean by interlocking gestures. Another thing that Leonardo does is he invents a technique, a painting technique. You can kind of see it here. You'll see it a little bit better in a couple of the other paintings that I show you, but it's called sfumato. Sfumato means smoky. So you want to know that term. So this mysterious cavern, totally imaginary. This place didn't exist, okay? This totally imaginary location that he put into the painting there. But he paints in that sfumato technique, that smoky technique. And then a related term that you want to know, these are both Italian words, okay? Chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro means clear and hidden, or clear and obscure, or it can mean light and dark. So notice how parts of the painting are very light, the faces, some of the fabric, and then other parts are very dark, and then there's some light shining through the cake. So know the term chiaroscuro. We're going to talk about that a lot. We're going to talk about that when we look at the art in the 1600s. It comes up later on. This idea of light dark contrast. So both of these terms apply to this painting. Sfumato, smoky. And that's particularly kind of like Leonardo's thing. Chiaroscuro, you see that in a lot of art by Leonardo and other artists. So putting these together, this is groundbreaking. That's why it says unified representation, figures, atmosphere, groundbreaking. What I mean by that, or what your textbook means by that, is we've seen a little bit of art now. And if you went back and looked at chapter 21 and chapter 20, you'd realize, hey, the artists were painting the human body. They were kind of starting to play with shadows, right? With lights and darks, different artists, depending on who I'm looking at. But now Leonardo has put this together in one painting. He's incredibly good, by the way, at the study of the human body. So he's got his figures. They don't look quote unquote real. We're not saying that, but he's got fully realized, fully kind of created bodies, but then they're also in this atmosphere, this smoky atmosphere. So putting those two together, that's something groundbreaking and new. And the last thing you want to know about Leonardo, as far as this painting goes, he's playing with oil paint. So I was really stressing Italy is south of the Alps. They're painting with tempera and they're painting with fresco. Now in the 1500s, they're starting to adopt oil paint and apply it to the paintings that we'll see. So this is new for them in the South. It's new for the Italians. And then part of that, as Leonardo develops these techniques, sfumato, plays with oil paints, etc., he also says, hey, painting is better than sculpture. And that may sound to us like, okay, but you want to know this was a big discussion at the time, which was a more elevated art form. As artists are getting this new role of being sort of seen as superstars, creative people, they're also debating, is it better to make a painting which is flat, but I can use the colors, shadows, etc., or is it better to make a sculpture, which of course is round? So I could actually depict a person from all three sides and you could walk around them. Part of the Renaissance, right? Part of this rebirth, this idea of looking back at the ancient world and saying we're going to not only do that, but we're going to maybe even do something better. I love this painting, by the way. It's a beautiful painting. Like I said, it's in the Louvre Museum in France. So there's that Renaissance triangle. And then the blue circle there is just to show how when we talk about composition, I put the blue circle on there, of course, but how the bodies sort of fit into that blue circle. So you can see Leonardo is doing both of these things to create a really balanced composition. So some of these terms, I'm just going to repeat them, right? There's the smoky, right? So this is a drawing. This is a big drawing in the National Gallery in London, 4.5 feet tall. That's big for a drawing, okay? So sfumato, I know that means smoky. There's my pyramid, right? See how the figures are leaning in, the bodies are leaning in and coming toward the center. So this, again, is the same cast of characters. It's baby Jesus holding his right hand. He's in the center. And then his cousin John leaning toward him. Then his mother Mary on the left-hand side. And then another person who's called Elizabeth. So I've got this interaction of the family. I've got the hands moving around. Now this is what we call a cartoon. Okay, this is what we call a cartoon, which means it's a planning drawing. So when you're going to do a fresco painting, or maybe what's called a tapestry, which we haven't studied, you needed a schematic. You basically needed a blueprint. And you can get into it in the textbook more if you want about all the parts of doing a fresco. But you needed a full-scale drawing. Then you would transfer that image to the wall surface through this really cool technique. So please know the term cartoon. It's a planning drawing. But because artists started to get more appreciated and more valued, people also started saving their planning drawings. It's like if you wrote, something as a second grader, and then you had to write the essay again, and your mom or whomever like, oh, I love this so much, I'm going to keep your little first drawing that you did. Okay, so this wasn't meant to be the finished artwork. It was a planning thing, but people kept it because they started saying, now we really see what the artist was thinking as the artist was planning this. So this isn't quote finished, right? The woman's hand that's pointing up in the air, you see how there's not shading stuff. So this was never meant to be the quote finished or final artwork. As part of the plan. Also, please be aware that paper is extremely sensitive to light. So oil paintings are pretty good. Oil paintings are pretty durable. They'll hang in there pretty well, okay? Paper, super sensitive. And so it's in its own special room in the National Gallery in London where they control the light levels and stuff. And when you go in Museum of Fine Arts Houston or any museum, if the rooms are really dark, it's because the things in the room are really sensitive. Light can really damage artwork. It can damage anything, but it can really damage artwork. Okay, the third Leonardo that we're going to talk about, and you notice I'm saying Leonardo, his name is not Da Vinci. Okay, Leonardo is a guy who part of his name was Leonardo, and then he was from a place that was basically called Vinci. So Leonardo from Vinci. So that's why we call him Leonardo. Not never ever call him Da Vinci. That way you can impress people that you know. Okay, all the books where they're like Da Vinci Code and different. That's not the guy's name. That's like going up to you and calling you Houston because we're in the city of Houston. Okay, so third painting, third artwork by Leonardo, Last Supper. So we've seen this one before. We've seen this Last Supper painting before. So we saw this artist, Dietrich Boots, working through how am I going to compose the image? I've got to have 12 people plus Jesus. This case, he had the other guys there are servants. So this is one way I can arrange the people. Where am I going to put Judas to show he's going to betray Jesus? Okay. And we talked about this before and some other things in this one. But think about the idea of the composition, how you get the 12 bodies around a table plus Jesus. And then we looked at one Italian Last Supper that's in your textbook. Here's another one not in your textbook. So I'm just using this as an example. So this is in the 1460s, okay? 1480s. Now we're in Italy. We're painting on a big wall in fresco, really, really big wall, okay? So here the artist named Ghirlandaio, here the artist, he put Judas, this is traditional location, Judas is put on the outside of the table to show he's separated from Jesus. And then if you count across, if I'm doing a composition, if I'm trying to arrange or organize my artwork, you would think you would want Jesus at the center, right? Because he's like the center focus, but the numbers don't work because Judas has to be over there. So in this case, there's two on the far right talking to each other. This guy leaning with his hand on his hand. And you can go through that and see they're sort of broken up into sort of groups. Some of them are talking to each other, some of them are not. And then Jesus kind of gets pushed a little bit off to the left. So I'm not criticizing this. I'm just saying there are many, many Last Supper paintings, and artists sort of work this process out. Where are we going to put everybody? What are we going to show them doing? How are we going to represent what's happening to tell this story? Because it's not just the idea that they're having the Last Supper and then Jesus will be crucified. It's the idea exactly when in this supper is the painting showing what's taking place. So the Last Supper then by Leonardo, what makes it such an amazing composition is it represents lots of different things artists have been working on. So let me mention a few things. Let me show you some other diagrams and sort of jump back and forth on this. First thing you want to know about this is lots and lots of damage. So we're not seeing the painting what it looked like at all. He's experimenting with combining oil paint and the earlier idea of using tempera paint, like the egg tempera painting that I mentioned briefly before. So he's trying to mix different paints that just didn't work. They started flaking off as soon as he was done. And if you've ever had a job painting a house or help people using paints, if you don't mix them properly, or if you mix oil paint and latex, it's really a mess. So we're not seeing the painting as it would have looked originally. Second thing, it's been damaged further because they cut a door underneath. This is, again, it's on a wall. It's on a wall in a building in Milan in North Italy. So they cut a door underneath. So that part's missing as well. So we have to use our imagination a little bit. We have to understand we're not seeing it as it went about. So now let's talk about it. Okay. So the first thing is you can see here, and I'm going to jump back and forth, very clearly you can pick out who the central figure is. And Leonardo did a number of different things to do that. You probably recognize this now because you've had this in other chapters, but you probably recognize there's my perspective, right? There's my linear perspective. Notice how the room, those walls on either side with the openings in them, those don't make any sense as a building, but they make a lot of sense visually, that they're putting the line coming down toward the center. And then notice the window behind Jesus. You could see, before all the damage happened, there's a semicircle. Above the window, there's a semicircle above Jesus. So it's like part of the building, but it's also like the idea of Jesus's halo. So all these lines are coming together in this one point perspective. So we know that term, we know that idea. They're coming together in this one point perspective right where Jesus is. You see that? Okay. So that's one of the ways this is really cool in its composition. Second thing is, instead of trying to do the groups and having twos and somebody on the other side, Judas is on the same side of the table, but he's still marked out. He's to our left. Okay, there's the group of three. There's the man with his hand on the table whose skin is a little bit darker and he's got darker hair. That's Judas. Okay, so by putting Judas on that side, you can have the 12 disciples broken up into groups of three. So in that way, there's a group of three on the far right talking to each other. There's a group of three next over looking at Jesus and pointing their hands up. There's a group of three that includes Judas. And then there's a group of three on the far left. The other thing the artist did, Leonardo did, is notice how the figures on the end lean forward. If you're an artist, if you're, you don't want to copy Leonardo, you want to do your own thing. But if you can think about things that bring people into your painting or into your drawing. So this is a really, really cool example of that. So all of that is very subtle. None of it's like, oh, I'd notice that. But all these things are putting together, taking this whole thing and saying, I'm going to create this really focused, really zoned in composition to bring you into the center through how I create my composition. It's amazing, amazing artwork. And you see the hand there pointing up. You saw that earlier in the drawing. See the hand pointing up? Okay, that's Saint Anne there. And then it's one of the apostles, the hand pointing up. So Leonardo, he's recycling some of his ideas. So we want to know that linear or one point perspective. So here's the moment in the story. By the way, like I said, this is in a building. It's in a refectory again. So we know a refectory is where the monks or the nuns would gather for meals. So the Last Supper artwork often put there. It's his largest artwork. And Jesus is doing what today people call the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, where they have the bread and the wine. So Jesus has said to them, one of you is going to betray me. Okay, he said that, and that's in the Bible, and so that's a part of this painting here. And that's why everybody's reacting and holding their hands up and responding and talking to each other. So it's a really cool visual balance. It's a really cool balance of story with these different emotions. Now I talked about the window, and the pediment is that circle above the window, which makes that quote halo, the perspectival lines, and then the groups of three. And then please be aware, he's trying something new with his media, with his material, mixing the oil and tempera. So conservation, that's when we need to stabilize the artwork. We don't call it restoration, because they don't go back in, the scientists and the people who care for art don't go back in and try to change it, because that would be changing what the artist did. We call it conservation. We try to stabilize it and care for it. So the Last Supper had lots and lots of conservation. Some of it's very, very recent to try to work with this and try to help it. So again, an amazing painting for all those different reasons. It's not just famous because it's famous because it's a really well done work of art. Here's the other one, right? Can't have Leonardo, can't talk about this without talking about the Mona Lisa. But I want to try to convince you that it's actually worth thinking about. One of the reasons it's famous, it's not in your textbook, but one of the reasons it's famous because it was stolen about 120 years ago. And then it took a few years to get it back. So it kind of became notorious. It was already, people knew what it was, but it wasn't like, oh, this is the famous painting. But it was because it got a lot of publicity from that theft. So we're going to kind of put that aside. But I want you to know what actually matters, what's actually a really, really good painting. So Mona Lisa is just a short form of Madonna Lisa, or My Lady Lisa. So that's not her name. We know her name and we know who she is, but part of her name was Elizabeth. Okay. And so my Lady Lisa, My Lady Elizabeth. So she was the wife of an Italian banker. When we looked at the Arnolfini portrait, we said he was an Italian banker. So we've talked about the Italians before. Now this is in Italy. The Arnolfini portrait was painted in the north, in Flanders, but it's that same kind of idea of bankers having the money. We see that mysterious background, right? So we know now with Leonardo that he likes those mysterious backgrounds, right? He likes those smoky caverns. That's Fumato, right? So the Mona Lisa, the background isn't real. It's not a real place. It's a made up imaginary location. And she's got this very high, what we call horizon line, very much like she's up on a balcony and we're looking out. Totally, totally imaginary landscape. Chiaroscuro, like I said, you already know that term because I've already introduced it, but that means those lights dark. Since Fumato, we know, means smoky. Now, here's what's actually really radical about her for the art of the time. Number one, paintings were very expensive. If you were wealthy enough to have your portrait painted, it was a big deal. It was like buying a car. It was literally like the price of a pretty nice car to get a portrait done. Not like kind of sort of, it's like literally cost that amount of money. So typically, you're going to want a portrait to show off. If you've got it, you're going to want your portrait to show it off, your worldly possessions and stuff. She's not doing that. She's dressed very simply. She looks pretty dressed up to us, but she's not wearing jewelry. She's not wearing a bunch of other stuff that she might have had that we can imagine she probably had. So she's not highlighting her status and her wealth. That's one of the things that's very different. Gives us a really different perspective on her. The second thing is, she's really famous for smiling. Women at the time, upper class Italian women at the time, didn't do that. In real life, they didn't do that. They didn't look at men. This was the rules at the time. I'm not saying it's right, but that was the rules at the time. They didn't look at men. They didn't interact with men. They really didn't go out in public a huge amount. So to show her seated in a chair, turning her head toward us, making eye contact, and then that little smile, that just wasn't done in portraits in the 1400s and into the early 1500s. And then it wasn't done in real life. So women in real life typically would not have been doing that, and women in portraits weren't shown that way. So that's why it says unprecedented. That was something new. So here's a portrait from 1489, not in your textbook. You don't need to learn this one. I just want to show you. So when Mona Lisa is painted 1503, right? 15 years later, give or take, right? Totally, you see how totally different that is? So that's the style shown in strict profile view, side view, okay? Dressed up, really elaborate, with jewelry, all the things that show wealth, okay? Definitely not making eye contact, definitely not relating to the viewer. So that's what actually makes this, from a historical standpoint, a really interesting artwork. Not the thing about, is it just famous because it's famous? It's a tiny little painting, by the way. It's less than 3 feet tall, but it's famous because what he was trying, and it's important because what he's trying and doing things that were new. Last thing on this one, I didn't put it in the notes, but just if you are answering a test question, women pluck their eyebrows and they pluck their hairlines. See how high their hairlines look there, and their eyebrows look pretty faint. So that was actually the style of the time. Okay, it wasn't that she's missing eyebrows or she's missing hair. It was the style of the time. There has been paint loss, but that's not the reason that her hairstyle looks like it looks. So that's the Mona Lisa. Oh, by the way, I didn't put this in the notes, but her hands are incredible. The work in her hands, because Leonardo is so good with human anatomy, so good at study of the human body, which again is something else that was pretty new. Okay, wasn't done that much. So here's one of his scientific drawings. So he keeps notebooks. These are very famous, and you can go online and you can look at drawings and text from Leonardo's notebooks. So he studies the natural world. He studies the way water flows. He studies inventions. He studies rocks. He studies the human body a lot. Okay. So this is one of his drawings. And you also want to know that drawing itself had become less expensive during this time. Materials were still pricey. Like I said, paintings were super expensive, but paper had become slightly less expensive. Pen and ink, the pencils are invented the way we think of pencils. And then I already said this, but let me emphasize this again. In the 1500s, the drawings by artists, where it says artistic prominence, what that means is that, again, people started to keep it rather than just go, that was just a little sketch they did or a little plan they did. People started to keep these drawings and keep this stuff when the artist died, for example, because it's like, this shows their creativity. This shows how their mind is actually working. Again, that term genius that I mentioned. So you want to be aware of that. So here's a couple of things to know about this specific drawing of all the ones that he created. It shows the human fetus, which is the first time to be done in a scientifically correct way. So this is the first, if you're a biology major, if you're studying, the medical field, anything like that, Leonardo is really the first one to originate what today you would think of as scientific illustration, which is still an important field today. Even with photography, there's still times you need an artist or somebody to be able to create those images. So he originates this. This first, and so in this case, his first correct depiction of the human fetus in the womb, then the uterine wall and some other things are in that drawing. Here's the extra credit. And this is sad if you think about it. What's unique about this fetus? If you know somebody who's been through having a baby, you may be aware of this. What's unique about this fetus? If you understand, like I said, how, the basics of childbirth, a fetus can be breech. It can be upside down. where it's trying to not be born head first, but basically its bottom is trying to come out first. So that's what happened here. So unfortunately, this is from a woman who passed away during childbirth, and then the autopsy was done on her and then on the deceased child. So this baby is breached. This baby is upside down. Our daughter, when our daughter was being born, the baby was breached, and even with modern technology, it's scary. It's scary what they, of course, the baby would have a cesarean, or the mother would have a cesarean. So please beware scientific illustration. That's the end of Leonardo. Again, really, really amazing artist. A couple of things about Raphael. He's the second of the big three. Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo. But Raphael is really hard to talk about because he's so good at what he does. It's just sort of effortless. You don't really get the sense that he's creative almost. Okay. He used to be more famous. He used to be more famous in like the 1800s. People look back at them and said, "Oh, he was it." Now we kind of like Leonardo because we know more about what he's thinking, and Michelangelo is like a real temperamental guy. Raphael's just so smooth in the way he makes his art that it's almost hard to like find out what's so amazing about it. So I'm going to show him, but it's limited to what I can say. So where it says exemplifies the high Renaissance, he's like it again because he's so capable. He's so technically capable. He's so visually balanced in how he makes his work and how he creates them. So here's the story of this painting. It's a good sized painting. It's it's 5 feet tall. The story is that Mary, Virgin Mary, was going to. This is a apocryphal story. It's a made up story. Was going to marry whose ever rod grew flowers. So all the guys on the right there, they all want to marry Mary, who's in the red and the blue. And then they've got their stick. You're walking on the desert, you've got your stick. And the story is, okay, whoever's stick, which would have been dead, starts growing flowers. That's when that Mary should get married to. So that's what you're seeing there. That's what you're seeing there. So then she's being married to Joseph. What we want to know about with Raphael is, again, how rational this painting is. The lighting is very, very even. Excuse me. The lighting is very, very even. So I don't have that chiaroscuro. I don't have that smoky effect like I do in the Mona Lisa. You see that? Okay. Very clearly balanced in the lighting. When I say lighting, of course, I'm talking about paint. There's no physical light shining on this. I'm talking about the way the painting is done to give that sense of even lighting. So then I've got that centrally planned building in the background. So that symmetry of this totally imaginary building, totally made up building. Then when we say rational space, he really wants you to know about that linear perspective, right? So he actually painted the pavement to give you those squares going back there. And then foreshortening, remember that term, right? Foreshortening, making the body look like it's bending out or coming toward you. So you see the fellow on the right there breaking a stick because he's disappointed. So this very smoothly painted, very slick foreshortening of the body there. So that's Raphael. Like I said, he's so good. He's so effortless. It's just kind of hard to make him sound, stressed or worried or anything. It's just really, really good at how he creates the work. So you would know, if this popped up, you would know it's a high Renaissance painting, right? Because you go, there's my pyramid, right? Okay. But again, we don't have the sfumato. Instead, we got this clarity, this very clear lighting, very well lit. Okay. One of the things I want you to know about these paintings, this one in particular, and then others, if you see this, is what the imagery represents. So there's different things when Mary is holding the baby Jesus to symbolize that baby Jesus will be crucified. So this is a good one for us because, again, there's Jesus is on the right, John is on the left. Okay, and you've seen that now several times just to make sure we're thinking about this. There's John on the right, there's baby Jesus in the center, there's baby Jesus on the right, there's John on the left. So the same image is popping up over and over again, or same subject matter is popping up over and over again. So when Raphael is doing this painting with Mary and then John and then baby Jesus, often it'll represent not only the birth of Jesus, that he's born as a person, which is why he's nude, to symbolize he's not a God, he's a human being, but then also that he's going to be dying on the cross. So that's why he's reaching out and holding the cross-shaped stick there, or the cross-shaped staff. Okay, so please be aware that when it says premonition, it means foreshadowing the idea that this is going to come up in the future. There's other things that are used in the artwork as well, but that's kind of the easiest one to point at and easiest one to notice. Okay, the other Raphael I want to show you is really, really cool. So here's a close-up of a cartoon. So we said a cartoon is a preparatory drawing. We said they don't usually survive because they get used, as part of getting the artwork done. But this is the cartoon here that's for a great big fresco painting. Okay, and you kind of get a feel how big these are. Okay, the actual painting is 26 feet across and 9 feet up. So these people in the drawing, you can see that kind of would have been life size. And then the way this is done, I won't go through all the details, but they would make the drawing, they would put it up against a wet wall where they were going to paint the fresco. And then they would poke holes in the drawing. They'd poke holes in it. And then they would do little charcoal. They would pop it on there and it would make little dots. And then they would take the paper away and then they could connect the dots. Complicated, but you can't just draw on wet plaster. It's too hard. So you had to have a plan. You had to know what you're doing. So this is a cartoon. So please be aware, this is a good example of a cartoon. Here's the finished painting. So the guy's on the right there. The guy in orange kind of has his head turned sideways, right-hand side. The guy on sort of sloping on the stairs there, sort of falling down the stairs almost. That's the guy's head there. You see that guy there? And you look there, see the man in orange, kind of right-hand side. That shows you how big this painting is. Okay, this great big painting. So this is in Rome. So we said it says Rome important because we want to know some really important stuff starts going on in Rome in the art world. So Florence, we've seen art from Florence. Now we're going to see some art from Rome. So this is in a place that was for the Pope. And the Pope of the time was Julius II. So if you'll please recognize his name, because you're going to see it about 4 or 5 times in a row here as I go through these artworks. So Julius II, and he wants the apartments decorated, his apartments, okay? They're like private apartments, but they're also where they would have done a lot of business and stuff, right? The business of being the Pope. And so this artwork then is going to represent different ideas that were important at the time in the Renaissance and also for religious people. So what the two guys are doing there, what the two guys are doing in the center, there's the man with a blue cape on, and then there's the man next to him with a reddish cape on. I'm talking about literally right in the center of the painting. They're arguing about heaven and earth, right? So that kind of makes sense for the papal apartments, that the Pope's apartments. The reason I have Sistine Chapel, you'll see that in just a moment, but that's also going to be Julius II. So this one Pope is a big deal for the Renaissance, for the high Renaissance, working with Raphael, working with Michelangelo, different artists. So there's 4 paintings. Okay, there's 4 paintings in this room. We're looking at one of the 4. Okay, and now we're looking at a smaller part of one of those 4 paintings. So you see the two guys here. Guy on our left, his hand is going up, pointing to heaven. His right hand's going up. The guy on our right, his hand is reaching down, pointing toward the earth. So this wall, of these 4 walls, they're debating philosophy. So the architecture is like ancient Rome, okay? And then the two people having the argument, if you've ever heard of Aristotle, he's a famous scientist from Greece, okay? A real person who lived in real life. Plato, he's a famous philosopher. So they're debating, hey, is what we think about more important? That's why Plato's pointing up towards heaven. Or is what we do more important, and the things we create and manufacture and stuff? Aristotle's pointing down towards the earth. So this was a big symbolic debate to depict in a place that's being run by the Roman Catholic Church, right? Because they're debating things like, hey, is religion more important or is what we're doing on earth more important? I'm getting pretty philosophical here, but that's kind of what the painting is, right? So other thing you want to know about this, you can see that symmetry, that organization, you can see that 1-point perspective. You know all that stuff now because you're seeing it showing up over and over again. You want to know that the vanishing point where all the lines come together is in Plato's left hand, okay? So he's got his right hand pointing up toward heaven, and his left hand's holding a book, and all the lines are coming together right there. Here's another kind of Where's Waldo question for you. You've seen a lot of self-portraits already in some of the other chapters. Artists get put into works. In this case, we don't know, unless they revise your textbook and have changed the information. But we think that Michelangelo, who's going to be incredibly famous, is the guy bottom left, the guy with his hand holding a pen and sort of his hand on his chin there or hand on the side of his head. We think that's Michelangelo. So that's another good extra credit for you. That's probably Raphael putting Michelangelo in there. Not 100% certain, but it probably was. Here's the last Raphael I want to show you. This one, I want to have it just because it's different. Okay. So here he is working with frescoes, clear lighting, very symmetrical, very balanced, very rational visually. But this painting, a little bit later on, Raphael dies at a young age. He's playing with different media, different materials. He's painting with oil paintings. He's showing the Medici. The Medici are the family. All with Botticelli, we said that was done for the Medicis. So the Medici are the family who also, several of them ended up being connected, either becoming Pope or being connected with that. So this is a Medici Pope in the center here. And then these are two relatives of his who are cardinals, which are high officials in the church, the Roman Catholic Church, behind him. But you see how everything looks slightly scary? Okay. So it shows he's learned. He's got a valuable book, which we know about, and a bell, which is very, very valuable in front of him. But Raphael now, the artist, instead of that clear, balanced light, has gone to this raking light. So these two Raphaels, look how different they are. They're both oil paintings, but the one on the left, now the light is like it's coming in from the side. And the background, of course, is very, very low values, very, very dark. And then notice how the table, you can't quite tell where it goes. It just kind of runs off the front left-hand side of the painting here. So the Medicis, because we know a lot about them, there was a lot of intrigue. There was a lot of fighting in the family, and then also fighting over the whole church thing and, who was going to be the Pope and this kind of stuff. And you can really pick up, again, we know about it, so we know that story, but you can really pick up on that vibe there. So Raphael, when he wanted to, could create that as compared to this more balanced, visual, clear lighting that we're seeing on the right there with the Madonna, with the Virgin and baby Jesus. So that's the end of Raphael. Last part we're going to have in this video is again about Michelangelo or Michelangelo. And the reason I keep bouncing back and forth, you can say it either way. The Italian would have been a little bit more like Michelangelo. Most of the time in American English, we say Michelangelo. They're totally fine. And again, he's got a longer name also. So you've noticed the big three artists, none of their names are actually the name they were given that we use when we talk about him today. So like Leonardo, he's an architect, he's a poet, he's an engineer, he's a sculptor, he's a painter, he's a multi-talented guy. And he debates with Leonardo. This was a famous debate at the time. He says sculpture is better. He's a painting, it's just flat, right? You're not making reality. When I'm carving sculptures, which are what he's most famous for, I'm finding these figures locked in the stone. I'm releasing them from the stone. And you'll see some of that in some of his sculptures. He, again, he's part of the world around him, and he works for the Pope and all these different kind of things. But he's a lot closer to the way we think of an artist today. Again, like I said, what's a movie maker, or if you may be thinking about a painter, or if you're thinking about a musician where they really kind of go their own way and do their own thing. We're used to that today, but at the time, he was something new in the world, okay? So where it says artist as we think of it, best first seen in Michelangelo, he's not the only one, but he's really kind of sets that example for the way we tend to think about artists. We don't tend to think of them as being corporate and working just for a job and doing things just for, just because they want to go 9 to 5 and all that kind of stuff. We think of them as like creating, and then maybe they get paid, maybe they don't. He's the one who really sets that up. So where it says does not trust our rules, I'm not saying he's not part of it all, but he's very much a rule breaker, very complex, very eccentric, very much doing his own thing as a person. So please it's hard to put that into simple slide show here, but kind of be aware of that. Be aware that when you think of an artist, he's the guy, among other people, but he's the guy who really sets it up. So here's his first major sculpture. And again, these are all big. This is over 5 feet tall. Okay. And it's multiple figures, which is hard to do in marble. Marble is very, very heavy. So it's called a Pietà. So if you'll please be aware, Pietà is the idea, or Pietà is the visual theme of Mary grieving over Jesus after Jesus has been crucified on the cross. Okay, so that's what a Pietà means. It has a very specific meaning. What's incredible about this one, marble, it's a pretty hard stone. It's hard to work with. Okay, it's a very substantial stone. What's incredible about this one is the number of textures that he got in here. Incredibly high polish, because again, nothing's mechanical, right? All this is being done by hand. So this polish and this texture, really working this marble to create that kind of swooping fabric. And you notice that, by the way, when you look at this, you notice Mary is way too big or Jesus is way too small. You can think about it either way. It's not that Michelangelo didn't know what he was doing, but there's a symbolism to that. And so we assume that this was probably the idea that he's being held like her child. He's a fully grown adult, but the idea that he's being held in this sort of where his mother is sort of encompassing, sort of wrapping around him. We see that elsewhere as well. So he's quote too small, but it's not like, oh, the artist didn't know what he was doing. And the other part of that is that some of these pietas, Jesus, because he's been killed on a cross, is shown much more damaged, much more looking like somebody who's been horribly tortured. And here, it's not that feel. That's where it says peaceful sleep. It's not that you're supposed to literally think he's asleep, but again, it's more like the mother holding the baby or holding the child when the child's kind of going to sleep. It's more that feel of the way the bodies are moving. And then the other thing you want to be aware. So you want to know Pieta is the idea of Mary grieving over the dead Jesus. The other thing you want to know is that Mary was traditionally shown looking very young, because for the Roman Catholics, the idea was that she was a virgin. So she had the virgin birth of Jesus, and that she stayed a virgin through her life. And so she would have always appeared youthful. So it's to symbolize her purity and her virginity is why we have many images of the very young looking Mary, even though, in the biblical chronology, she would have been 40 or 50 years old. So this, again, Michelangelo's first major artwork. And like I said, about 5 feet tall, a little bit over 5 feet tall. Now this one is massive. I can't put a photograph to really show you how physically tall this is, because everything tends to look the same height on the screen. But you want to know, this is one enormous piece of marble. The finished sculpture is over 17 feet tall. So the piece of marble was bigger than that. Marble is extremely heavy. Please be aware, marble is extremely heavy. Roughly speaking, it weighs about 3 times as much as you do. So if they made a sculpture of you, and say somebody weighs 200 pounds, okay? If they made a sculpture of that same person, it would weigh at least 600 pounds and more than that if you carve the clothing, all that kind of thing. So that's why when marble, you'll realize once you start thinking about that, there's never unsupported marble, okay? You can't carve, for example, you can't carve a human body because our ankles are too small. If you carved it's a human body and there wasn't additional support, it would tend to want to break off at the ankles because it's carrying 3 times the weight that the human body carries. So you always see some kind of tree stump. You'll always see something helping support the marble. Now the statue, this Michelangelo's David statue, is inside a building today. So we're seeing a photograph of it. That's why the photograph isn't that great. Inside the museum where it is today. But please be aware, it was originally carved to be outside on top of the church, on top of the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence that we've already seen before, which is really tall. So it was carved for people to be looking up at it. They would have been looking way up from ground level, would have been on the outside of the church, and they would have been looking up to see it. And so the point of view, the literal point of view would have been looking up. And so the hands, for example, are quite large in the statue. But if you saw them from the ground level, they would have looked more normal size because of your point of view. So I'm going to show a couple different views just to give you a sense of that. But again, we're looking at it 2-dimensionally. 3-dimensionally, it would be different. So a lot of marble around Florence and a lot of marble in Italy. So that's why we get so many marble statues from there. And even today, there's a kind of marble called Carrara marble, which is famous all over the world, that comes from the region near Florence. So that's why they're working with marble. So here's what you want to know about this statue, and I'll jump back and forth to some other slides. So this is the symbol of Florence. David, from the Bible, there's the story of David and Goliath. David goes out with his sling. He's a shepherd boy. He's a young guy, okay? He goes out with his sling in front of the armies of the Jewish people, and he fights Goliath one-on-one. And he does that by using a slingshot, which he would have spun in a circle, not like a slingshot we think about it, and then thrown the stone, and it would have hit Goliath in the forehead and killed him. So what we have in the statue here is he's holding his sling in his left hand, and then he's holding a stone in his right hand. So the symbol of Florence, the symbol of watchfulness, okay, the symbol of guarding against your enemies. So here's the church. They made a copy of this and they put it way up high on the church. Okay, that's dozens and dozens of feet above the ground. So you can see how different it looks and we're seeing it inside a building. And then on the right is a copy of it. These are both copies that was displayed for a long, long time. This is how the David was displayed for a long, long time. It was actually displayed just a few feet above the ground. So it never, the original statue never actually got put up on the church where it was intended. Because when Michelangelo finished it, it had already become so famous. The people of Florence, they didn't want to put it up high. They wanted to keep it down where it was at eye level where they could see it. So the giant is the name of the block of marble. This massive, huge block of marble. It came out of the quarry that sat there for years because nobody knew what to do with it. And when David carved it, when he carved the giant, made the David statue, when Michelangelo carved the David statue, that made Michelangelo really, really famous. That kind of made him, okay? So next thing on there, Greco-Roman influence. So this is looking back at Greek and Roman sculpture, the contrapposto pose, the shifting pose, the idea of a nude male figure. So that's what we mean by that. Other thing I was here already said, it was done for high up on a cathedral. So the viewer would have had a low point of view, looked up at it. He's guarding the city of Florence. He was going to be up there on the cathedral. So his head is turning. He's looking out at the what's called the Arno Valley. He's looking out, or he would have been looking out around the countryside of Florence. And it's before the battle. You'll see other David statues. We'll have other David statues where it's like after the battle, or it's like during the battle. This is where he's coiled, he's intense, he's ready to start spinning around, because you would have spun around with your sling to throw it. And so it's this intense, focused kind of look. Slides just the slides just don't, his eyes are like really intense. Okay, it's hard to do something this big to really show it. But where it says compared to Raphael's rationality, what we mean is this kind of intense focus. Okay, this kind of intense energy compared to Raphael being a more calm, peaceful, like the one on the right there. So that's where these two guys working at the same time, same city, same location, competing with each other, but they're doing different stuff. There's a later one. So I'm going to come back to the one on the right. That's coming up after this test, for the next test. So I won't talk about it now, but that's a comparison that I'm making. You can see the sling, by the way. The one on the right, you can see the sling as he's getting ready to spin around and throw the rock at it. Different later artists. The one on the right, different later artists. I'll go through these other Michelangelos pretty quickly because it's going to repeat some of the same things, kind of help you understand that. Here's Moses. This was for Julius II. So like I said, this was for the Pope. He was going to have a really big tomb, ton of statues, and it didn't get done. Only a few of them got done. So this was one of the ones that Michelangelo did for that. So it's Moses because way at the beginning of the semester, we said if a guy has horns on his head, they translated the Bible wrong, or they translated the text wrong. It's supposed to be rays of light shining off his head, and they put horns. They misunderstood it. And then you can compare it to David with his head turning. So Michelangelo's David, the head turning. You see that? And then notice how the whole body is rotating. The left arm comes up, the right arm goes back. His left arm, his right arm. The left leg bends back, the right leg comes out. So this turning, the multiple directions that the body's doing. The shoulders turn one way, the head turns another. It creates this very powerful appearance. Very much giving the sense that, hey, he's ready to just stand up. And he's huge, right? He's 7 feet, 8 inches tall, seated. So he's this huge statue. You can see just this giant Moses just ready to jump up and twist and turn and move. Really incredible artwork. This is the last one of Michelangelo's carvings, and I'm just showing it. I had to leave it in this order because it's the way it's in textbook, but this really shows this idea of letting the figure come out of the marble. So this one's unfinished, okay? It's not completed. He would have still been carving on it more. So many of his sculptures were left unfinished. They're huge works. I mean, things happen, different things happen. But the idea, you can really get the idea there of carving into a marble block and then carving away, and then the part that's left is the human body coming out. So that's what we're talking about there. Okay, so last one for this video then is the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So the Sistine Chapel ceiling, it's in the Sistine Chapel, which is in the Vatican, which is in the city of Rome. So when you talk about the Roman Catholic Church, when we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, this is the place, right? This is where Rome is, and so it's the Pope's private chapel. Also, when they elect a new Pope, that's where the cardinals gather to elect a new Pope. So very important location at the center of the Roman Catholic world. So Michelangelo was commissioned by our friend Julius II, who we know, to paint the ceiling. There were already paintings on the walls. The building was built, the chapel was built in the 1400s, and then Michelangelo gets his commission in the early 1500s. So the walls already had paintings on them that he's going to paint the ceiling. It's pretty big. A good sized house is like 2,000, 3,000 square feet. So this is like the size of two houses, but you're having to paint it upside down on your back, 70 feet above the ground. This photograph is the best photograph I can get, where you can see the ceiling is not flat. I hope you can see that. The walls go up, and parts of them start curving out, then parts of the ceiling is round. It's hard to get a good photograph of this. So it's complicated perspective, curving surfaces. So despite all that, and basically working by himself, he had some assistants, but basically he's doing the painting. He's doing these frescoes, which are very time consuming to plan out. Basically, one person show, he gets this done in 4 years, okay, which is incredible to do that amount of work. Complicated painting. I'm going to show you this. Don't worry, I'm not going to expect you to know it because there's no way to pick stuff out. But I want you to know there's over 300 figures. And then if you went toward the altar, so that would be up where the candles are here, up where the back wall is also painted. If you went toward the altar and then you started walking backwards toward where we would be at the back of the chapel, that's how you would have seen this stuff. So if you down the right-hand sides, when you're up by the altar, okay, at the end there, next to the painted wall, then you're walking backwards, you would be turned the right way to follow the story from God creating the world to creating man to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, etc. So that would have taken you backwards. You would have walked backwards through the chapel to keep it straight what you were seeing. So again, I'm not going to ask you to know that. It's super complicated to see on screen, but do know it was a really complicated place to paint. Really, really hard to do, to create that kind of composition, and that there's over 300 figures. Here's what I am going to ask you to focus on. So of that, in the center there, I have where God is giving the spark of life to Adam. So we're going to take one part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and look at this for a moment. So this is, again, pretty good size. This is still 9 feet tall, 19 feet across. Okay, so these are well over life-size figures. Again, I keep saying this because that's just the way this chapter works. But another one of the most famous paintings of all time, right up there with the Mona Lisa. You've probably seen advertisements or billboards or posters or social media. Somewhere online, you've seen the two hands reaching out and almost touching each other. It gets used all the time in all sorts of different contexts. But this is the actual painting. This is where it came from. So now you know that. Let me go to the other slide, and I'll jump back to this one in just a second here. So totally new interpretation of this story. So the story had been around in art forever, of God giving life to Adam, okay? Or what we call the creation of Adam, God giving life to Adam. But what's new is that the figures are now based not on medieval, very flat looking artwork, like you might have studied if you're in Arts 1303, from the 1200s, 1300s. But the idea of these being based on Roman Greek sculptures, right? So they're paintings, they're not sculptures, but these muscular bodies, both the men and the women. So when we say God classical figure, that's what we're talking about. God just wasn't shown this way in art. He was shown very flat, like a mystical, symbolic God. Now he looks like a physical, three-dimensional, over life-size heroic figure, what we call a heroic figure. And then the same thing with Adam. Next thing we want to be aware of is in this, I'm going to interpret this a little bit here, a little bit more in your textbook, okay? But what's interesting is the Bible story and most of the artwork would show God creating Adam. That's why I had to go back and check the name of what they call this. But you notice here, God reaches out to give the spark of life to Adam, but what does Adam do? Adam also reaches out to get the spark of light from God. That's something new. That's very much the idea of the Renaissance, that people in some ways now are equal to God, okay? That people are also powerful, okay? So that's a different worldview. That's a different worldview. So be aware that Adam reaches out while God also reaches out. They reach out toward each other for this spike of life, okay? And then the other thing, and the figures on the right-hand side there, so we know that's God, we know that's Adam, totally certain about that. We don't know what some of these other figures represent. There's angels, but do be aware that under God's left arm, his left arm is incredible. See how his arm comes way around and he's got that long, long finger there. So we don't know whether that's supposed to represent Eve, because he's creating Adam, and then Eve is going to be next. It may also represent that that's the Virgin Mary, because in the interpretations that the Roman Catholic Church had of the Bible, they talked a lot about the new Adam, that Jesus was the new Adam. So Adam's from the Old Testament, and then Eve and her son Jesus are from the New Testament. So that's another possibility. So do be aware of the woman under God's left arm. We don't know for sure, but it could be meant to symbolize Eve, which is more likely, but it could also be meant to symbolize the Virgin Mary. They would have known when they painted it. We just don't have that information today. And then from an art standpoint, you want to know about these curving complementary shapes. You can see them, but like Adam's right leg coming down, okay? And then God's right leg swooping over that way. And then God's left arm up, and then Adam's right arm going down. So these complementary shapes where God's the outer curve and Adam's sort of the inner curve there, as those go together. That's, again, there's reasons this is such a famous painting today, not just because of the hand spark thing that we were talking about there. So last thing, and this is not in your textbook also, but I want you to know about this, and maybe it's another good extra credit. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was cleaned in the 1970s and 1980s. Okay, you can see it's a working chapel. Stuff happens in there all the time. And if you go to mass, you'll have incense, you'll have candles. So there was a ton of soot. The ceiling had gotten really, really dirty, really, really dark over the centuries. So when it was cleaned off, people were shocked by the colors, because these are colors that would have been used in the 1400s. These aren't Leonardo da Vinci's sfumato, smoky colors. These aren't chiaroscuro, light, dark. These are very bright colors that really kind of blew people away to see that, to realize Michelangelo was not using the colors they were thinking about at all. So please be aware of that. And the reason I'm so certain in that it's not just I've screwed it up or they screwed it up, is because when you paint with a fresco, you're mixing the paint, you're mixing what's called the pigment, you're mixing the colors with the plaster. So if you've got the wall, those are the original colors, because they actually have become part of the wall itself. So we know those colors are accurate, the ones that we're seeing now. So these centuries of soot and grime have been knocked off there. So long chapter, because so much of what happens before and then so much of what happens next for the next several centuries in the history of art connect with the Renaissance. So that's why we're spending so much time on it, because it helps make sense about a bunch of other stuff as well that comes before it and comes after it. So we'll pick it up in video 2. Video 2 is not as long as the first video, I promise you, but we'll pick up in video 2 to finish this chapter. So take care, everybody.